Hello and welcome to JP Miniatures. This is our first tutorial since our rebranding, and today we will be painting a Krulghast Cruciator from the Age of Sigmar Nighthaunt range. This is a model that I have had my eye on for quite some time for my Nighthaunt army, and I'm very pleased to say I managed to pick it up and thought it would make a fantastic start to our new time together as JP Miniatures. So let's grab some brushes and get started. So as you can see here, we have assembled the miniature and it is really quite stunning. Tons of detail, this great looking cross on the back, and we have primed it in white scar spray. Now this is a really good undercoat for this particular model and for any Nighthaunt model, as when you get to the sort of ethereal areas, which obviously on this model are a little bit darker than the other ones, but essentially it gives you a really good base to work from, and when you bring in some highlighting later on, be it either edge highlighting or with dry brush, it's a great way to start. So we're going to kick things off with Rhinox hide, and this is for all of the wooden areas. So particularly on this model, it is going to be the cross, the crucifix on the back of the model, but also, which I think is a really lovely detail to this miniature, the handles of the sort of torture equipment that he has attached to this cross are also wooden as well. So just pick these out now. Obviously try not to get this to other areas. Obviously if you do, it's not the end of the world. Most of this is going to be covered up with other colours later on that are also quite dark in their colour, so it shouldn't be too bad. So but work your way around and pick out these particular details, and then we can move on. Once you're happy with that Rhinox hide, the next thing we're going to be doing is looking at all the metal features, and for this we're going to be using lead belcher. Now I'm also going to be using a combination of both a small base brush and also a small layer brush, just for when you get to those smaller areas, particularly around the wooded area where we've already been, just so that you can keep the neatness there and mitigate any mistakes onto where we've already painted. So just take your time to work your way around those areas. There are quite a few metalled areas, so obviously there's all the ornate part on the back of the cross, as well as obviously all the chains and everything on the front, and then also particularly the face mask as well. Now not the interior part, because that part there is a sort of ghostly flesh, it's quite small, but also then you'll be looking at the obviously the rest of the mask itself. But so take your time, and once you've done this, the model should really start looking coming together and looking really good. Once you're happy with all that lead belcher, the next thing we're going to move on to is Black Legion contrast paint. Now if you don't have this to hand, you can use Abaddon Black. It will give you exactly the same effect, and this is for the sort of cloak over the top of the miniature. The reason I'm sort of choosing the contrast over Abaddon initially is just because this just flows just that little bit easier over the miniature, and just sort of helps speed the process up just ever so slightly, whilst at the same time giving us a really nice clean black. So next up, before we start adding some shade to the miniature, we're going to take some Mechanicus Standard Grey and just pick out the rocks at the bottom of the miniature, and also the gravestone head as well, so that when we come to add some shades and do the Ethereal effect later on, we don't risk getting any of this on that at that time. Once you've got that Mechanicus Standard Grey applied, next thing we're going to do is move on to a little bit of shading, and for this we're going to be using Agrax Surf Shade, and for this we're actually going to be putting this over the majority of the areas we've painted so far, with the exception of the black cowl. So just put a nice sort of thin layer of this shade over the top, just enough to obviously pick out the sort of recessed areas, but without creating any massive amount of pooling. And for this I'm actually sticking with a small base brush, so that I don't overload or cause any huge pooling on the model, and it gives you better control. So sort of slowly work your way around and then let this completely dry before moving on to the next step. Once you've let that shade completely dry, and before we move on to adding in any sort of ethereal effects and highlights, we're going to take a quick dry brush of Necron compound, and this is just to very gently go over those metallic areas that we have just shaded. Do take great care not to get this on the wooden part of the cross, but this is just simply just to just brighten up just ever so slightly those metallic areas that we've just dulled down with the Agrax Earthshade. So just to bring a little bit of shine back to the chains in certain places, just to give it a more realistic and weathered effect. So just add a little bit of this. If you want to go a bit heavy, you're more than welcome to, but I will be going quite light in this dry brush. Now, before we move on to the next step, it's really important that we now neaten up any of the white areas with white scar. That way, so we get nice clean finishes with the rest of the colours that we do. So just have a look at your model, and pick out any of those areas that you've caught with any other colour. I know I have for a few spots here. And then grab the white scar from the pot and just layer that over to recoat. Next up, we're going to be using some skeleton horde, and this is just to pick out the couple of skulls on the miniature. And these are predominantly the one on the base next to the little gravestone on there, and then also the one in the hand as part of this sort of ritual that the model is doing. So just carefully sort of work that skeleton horde in around the details that are there. Now obviously it won't coat entirely into a full skull, because obviously, as you can see, there is some sort of spell going on here. Next up, we're going to start working into that ethereal area at the bottom of the model. And for this, we're going to be using two different styles of paint. We're going to be using a mix of Incubi Darkness and Lamia Medium. We're going to be trying to thin this down to a sort of shade consistency, and I've sort of found a sort of 3-to-1 ratio of Lamia Medium to Incubi Darkness. It sort of gets us down to that sort of rate. And then we're also going to be using the Athematic Blue contrast paint, and we're going to try and do a little bit of blending here, starting sort of darker at the top and then working our way lighter towards the tips. So for this then, I'm using a sort of medium shade brush to apply these paints, and what we're going to do is start off with the darker Incubi Darkness mix, and we're going to start applying this towards the top of the miniature's ethereal areas. So starting from the inside, just literally start coating this over. Now obviously it will be slightly translucent at this point because we have thinned it right down, but that's not to worry. That is exactly what we're after, as we want it at the end of the day to be a slightly more ethereal effect. If you do find once this is dry that it's not quite dark enough to what you would like, then of course you can go in and add a second layer. Then what we're going to do once you've come sort of halfway down those tentacles is wash off your brush, make sure that is nice and clean, and then what we're going to do is get a little bit of the Athematic Blue contrast and just sort of start applying this to the lower areas. Now what you also want to do obviously when doing this is sort of work it into the mixture that we've been applying as sort of going down, so that they sort of create a nice sort of transitional blend into that. So you want to make sure that your mix isn't fully dry when starting this, so that you don't obviously create any sort of lines on the miniature or anything that you're not looking for in terms of that. So you do have to be quite quick when applying this to make sure that you can get the transitions that you're that you're looking for, and simply literally work your way around the miniature, applying these two paints, and sort of gradually sort of working from one paint to the other, and then let that completely dry before moving on to the next step. While you're then waiting for that other shade to dry, we can do the shading to the arms next, and the fleshed areas, and for this we're going to be using a mix of Nighthaunt Gloom and Lamia Medium. Now if you're using the new version of Nighthaunt Gloom, which is now a contrast, then I would suggest using contrast medium, just to keep the consistency right, but otherwise this is a 2:1 ratio, just to thin it down just that little bit, to make it flow that little bit more easy, and we don't want it to be quite so dark in all areas. And for this we're just going to be applying a small layer over all of the sort of fleshed areas that's left and to the model, which will majority be what's really left in the white, apart from the sort of spell part in the middle here. And what you're going to want to do is put a nice layer of this over the skin, and then let it dry, and then come back in with a second coat, but predominantly focusing this over the hands, because we do want those to be just that little bit darker than the rest of the skin. So do all of that, let that completely dry, and then we can move on to the next step. Once you've got all those shades dry, we're going to move on to some highlighting, and for this we're going to be turning back to Incubi Darkness, but this time just as a standard consistency rather than a shade consistency, and we're going to be highlighting the black cloak at the top of the model, and for this we're just going to be picking out sort of the raised parts of the cloak, just to give them a little bit of definition with the sort of more greener tone over the top of that black, and ultimately just change the hue of that slightly so it blends a bit more in with the sort of trail that we've got coming off. So sort of gently work your way around. As you can see, I'm sort of picking out any sort of raised areas. This is the sort of first of two highlights we're going to do, but essentially we're just sort of picking out the most prominent areas of the cloak, leaving the darker tones in the recesses. Once you're happy with that Incubi Darkness, we're going to move on to the final highlight for the cloak, and this is some Fenrisian Grey. This is literally just picking out the sharpest edges and ridges of the cloak, and should be used relatively sparingly, just on areas that are going to catch the light the most, like you can see here with me running my brush around the edge of the cloak, and then also picking out any of the top sort of ridges as well. So carefully take your time and work your way around there, and then let that completely dry. Next up, we're going to take some Dark Reaper, and this is actually just to pick out the fingernails on the miniature. These are quite small, so I'm not sure if the camera will pick this up predominantly, but basically you just literally keep a small layer brush, nice thin point to it, and just pick out all the nails around the hands. So work your way around, and we'll move on to the next stage. The next highlight we're going to be moving on to is Screaming Skull, and this is to pick out the couple of little skulls onto the miniature, just to pick out the highest edges and leave the skeleton horde that we applied earlier in the recesses. Next up, we're going to be looking at highlighting the wood on the cross, and for this we're going to be using Gothor Brown, and we're literally just going to be looking at picking out any sort of ridged and high detailed areas, as well as the sort of edges of what we already painted in the Rhinox hide, and obviously shaded as well. So just sort of gently pick out these areas. You can sort of apply as much or as little as this as you like, depending on sort of how bright you want the overall sort of wood effect to be, but sort of take your time and try and keep some nice sort of crisp lines as you're working up and down the edges, and then we'll move on. Once you're happy with that brown, next thing for us to do is to highlight up the silver areas, and for this we're going to be using Rune Fang Steel. and we're going to be using this just really on the sort of brightest parts where the light's going to touch the model. So on the tips of the chains, for instance. So we don't want to brighten the metals up too much because they are supposed to look quite rugged and worn, and sort of slightly rusted as well. So really just sort of any sharp edges and tops and tips of the metal, as I say, where the light's going to touch it the most. Just sort of run your brush along the chains. It's quite that's quite an easy method, and looks quite nice too. So work your way around and pick out as much of these as you like. Obviously you don't have to necessarily add any of this highlight if you don't want to. If you want it to stay looking all sort of grim and brown and dark, that is absolutely fine. It's sort of very in keeping with how these models are. Yeah, do as much as you wish. Once you're happy with those metal effects, we're going to move on to a very light dry brush now of White Scar, and this is over the arms and sort of fleshy areas of the model. Now you do want to take quite great care when applying this, so that not to obviously get it on the areas that we've already painted, but effectively just very gently apply this over the top of those skin, and we just want to brighten that back up again from the shading that we did earlier on, but do leave the sort of hands a little bit darker, as obviously we did apply those that extra shade over the top of there to keep that shade there, but essentially, yeah, just work your way up and down both of the arms just with a light dry brush of that White Scar. Once you finish that dry brush, next thing we're going to do is dry brush with a little bit of Ethereal grey, and this is over the Ethereal area that we shaded earlier on. We're going to be mostly focusing this down the bottom part of the sort of wispy tails to sort of just create that gradient from dark to light, and sort of gently work our way up. So the higher you get on the model, the lighter the brush wants to be touching the model, and then obviously the more closer to the cloak you get, it doesn't want to be really touching that at all. So focus your efforts mostly towards the sort of say taily wispy parts of the miniature. Where you'll also want to do is sort of dry brush just ever so lightly over the gravestone and the rocks of the miniature as well, just to obviously give those just that little bit of definition to be in keeping with the rest of the miniature. And then as a final highlight to the spirit area, we are going to use Ethereal grey just as a sort of edge highlight within any sort of open and crisp edges of the sort of tendrils here. So just carefully work your way around there. Obviously try not to make sort of too thick lines. It is literally just to pick out the sharpest of edges. The last things left to do on the model now then is to look at the sort of energy spell that they've got coming out of this skull and up towards the hands. For this we're going to be using a blend of two contrast paints, firstly Iodine Yellow and then Magos Purple as well, because if you look at the box art, the very top end of the spell towards the hand is actually quite dark, and it looks almost a little bit sort of purple in colour, and then you've got a little bit of a yellow in there as well. So we're going to apply this all over that spelled area, not too liberally. We're not going to go sort of all over it, but only in sort of parts, and then we shall add a lighter dry brush afterwards in order to sort of blend those colours together and give it a slightly lighter effect. So what we're going to start off with the Iodine Yellow, and we're just going to focus this towards the sort of bottom parts of the spell, and sort of pop this on, and then a little bit like with the blending we've done before, sort of take it so far up the spell obviously from one end, and then what we're going to do is wash the brush off and apply some Magos Purple, which we shall do in just a second. So there we've now washed the brush off and get a little bit of Magos Purple on the end of our brush, and start applying this from the top of the spell. I feel like this is a really nice sort of rich purple, not too sort of dark or intimidating in colour, but still offers a nice sort of bright and vibrant finish, which obviously is what we're trying to go for with the spell. We want it to stand out. It is something very different which you don't normally see on Nighthaunt models, as they are particularly more sort of green and blued ethereals, rather than a more brighter, sort of more vibrant colour like a pink or a purple. But there, as you can see, we are now sort of blending those two colours together in the centre join there, and then just sort of take away any sort of pooling excess. We don't want it to sit too heavy on there. We're just looking for a sort of nice neat coat between these two colours. We don't necessarily need it to sit too heavy on any joins or anything like that. We just want them to sort of gently pull themselves together and then dry quite nicely. Once those contrast paints have dried, the next thing we're going to do, just to finish this all off, is a quick dry brush of Ethereal grey once again, and this is just over that spelled area, just to help sort of blend that all in, one with the skull and also with the two paints up to the hand. So this is a very light dry brush because obviously we're not looking to try and take the colours away from the spell that we've just applied, but really just to add a little bit more sort of mystical to it, as well as help blend those colours together. So sort of depending on how your blend went, you'll probably want to add as much or a little of this as you feel fit, but just use your own sort of discretion as to how much you wish to use. And there we have a finished Krulghast Cruciator ready for the Nighthaunt army. All that's left to do now is to base the miniature in whichever way best fits the rest of your models, and ready for the tabletop. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please leave a like and a comment below if you have any questions. If not, I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you.